Welcome to Creativity in the Startup World, a series of conversations curated by the Tramprix for the Aldridge Foundation's Creative World of Work Week. For this session, I'll be speaking to Christopher Knowlton, co-founder of 18 Degrees and lighting designer. Christopher's passion for lighting and the belief that lighting can really enhance people's lives has driven his lighting career from a very early age and propelled it to where it is today. His fascination with light started in theatre and is now practiced daily within the built environment, where Christopher manipulates light to augment environments inside and out. His work spans theatre, events, fine art and architecture. I sat down with Christopher to talk about his earliest memories of lighting design, the importance of entrepreneurial spirit, and what it takes to succeed in his industry. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy this session with Christopher Knowlton, co-founder of 18 Degrees and lighting designer.
No, I didn't always know. No, I did. I think I've always been fascinated by light, and it comes from the very first sort of theatrical shows that I saw, and that kind of ability to like completely take something, like the house lights fade down, and that darkness is the beginning of something creative, or like the creation of something, and the way in which light can just really move your focus around was like the kind of start of that fascination. So I think it's that. I mean, I say I haven't wanted to do it for my whole life, but I think I started my first like proper theatre gig at age 12. And like that was kind of like my first exposure to working with other people. Yeah, since then I basically haven't done anything else.
So when you went in that theatre at age 12, was it in lighting? Was it in stage design and stuff like that, rather than actually being in like an actor?
Yeah, it was like stage management type stuff. So like running props around and kind of getting involved and like watching what was happening with the lighting and being like, oh, that looks cool.
So obviously you've got an interest there. You found an early place to explore that fresh feeling of being excited by a job. But when did you kind of know that it was a job and that you could do it for a living? When did that kind of come to your mind?
I think it was through. So that early experience when I was very young was with the National Youth Music Theatre (NYMT), and so I already knew that there was someone who was called a lighting designer. That was like their job. And then as I got older and I kind of was starting to look at it more seriously, and I think it's like a lot of niche things, like, or specialist things. You don't realize it's a job until you see it, but then suddenly you see it everywhere. And you're like, of course, that makes perfect sense. Of course, that's a job. And I meet other people who have like really interesting but super niche jobs. And you kind of think, yeah, I never really thought about that as a job. But of course, it's a job because it's like a really like interesting thing. Why wouldn't someone be interested in it?
Mm.
So, but I think from that early stage, I kind of knew that it was a thing, but like what it would lead to or how I would do it, I had no idea.
No clue. Okay, cool. That's interesting.
Secondary school, so GCSE A level, and then I did lighting design at Central School of Speech and Drama for undergraduate, and then I did postgrad in light and lighting, which was part of the Bartlett School of Architectural Graduate Studies at UCL. So a bit of both.
And then when you hire people, are those things that you specifically, would you only ever hire someone in that space who have been through those academic routes, or do you feel like there are ways now for people to get into your industry without doing the traditional academic route?
Lighting design as a profession, I think, is incredibly diverse. We have people who come because we're not like, if you want to be an architect in this country, there is a formal process of education. You have to go through certain stages and you have to achieve certain things in order to call yourself an architect. So in that sense, they're a regulated profession. We're unregulated, which is both good and bad. But it means that you have people coming to lighting design from product design, graphic design, industrial design, theatre, architecture, and so really there's a lot of paths that mostly when we're looking to employ people, we're usually looking that they've got at least some kind of conceptual understanding of what it is we're doing, or at least the construction process from design through. But I don't think that you have to be super formally trained to get started. In terms of recruitment, I think that there are some, like, we're quite a small practice, so for us it's quite, our new hires, we look for very specific things, and it's normally related to a skill that we don't have or something that we specifically need. Larger practices are much more open to taking people in who've got little experience but want to start and just basically work from like being a junior designer right the way through. And I would hope that when one day we're big enough to support that, we would also do something similar. I think that the space is super competitive in a way, and yet we're all looking for really good people. And I think that most larger practices are really looking for people to come, and almost there's a sort of a slightly terrible thing. It's a double-edged thing, which is, you know, most people like juniors to come in so that they can mold them into what they want them to be. And that's, you can take that as both a good and a bad, but there's definitely space for people to come in and learn on the job as well, because people also understand that what you learn in a classroom doesn't necessarily translate directly to what we do on a day-to-day basis. I think that there's it's a combination, I guess, in architecture. So the space that we're working in at the moment is mainly in architecture and public realm. And the instant gratification of seeing something lit, that doesn't exist in a sense, because in a theatre show, typically you'll put some lights up, you'll switch them on, and you'll kind of get on with it. And in architecture, the process is you'll draw some lights, you'll draw them about 300 or 400 times, and in a few years' time, they'll get switched on. And that won't be as exciting a moment as you kind of think it will, because it all happens really slowly, and you know, it's not that kind of like instantaneous thing. But on the flip side of that, you do get those moments where you kind of stand back at the end of the job and go like, wow, we've created something amazing, and it's going to be here for ages. You know, and this is a really permanent sense of like actually doing something, which I think conceptually is quite a different experience. You don't get that kind of instant like, ta-da, here it is. But you do get the, you know, 3 years later, you're in King's Cross and you're going for a drink and you're like, oh, should we just swing by that building I lit? And you're like, here it is, isn't it cool? You know, it's a different experience. Yeah, it's still, I mean, I still find my work exciting. And I suspect that most of that actually is down to people. Like, I enjoy working with people, and therefore working on lots of projects with lots of different people. And it can be highly challenging a lot of the time because of people. Designing a building and putting it up would probably be easy if it weren't for the people involved. I think it's one of the things that if anyone had been really honest with me when I was younger, was take psychology and anything to do with like group dynamics, group thinking, like how do you get teams to come together, interpersonal skills. Doesn't matter what you want to achieve in life, in whatever industry, you're going to have to deal with people, and your ability to relate to and communicate with others will define everything that you do, personally and professionally. And so I think that if someone had told me that when I was younger, I think I might have cottoned on to stuff a lot quicker. There's so many things that annoy me, but mostly the things that really upset me are seeing things like street lights that are on during the day, or office blocks that are lit up at night when you can see that there's no one in them, or, you know, lighting accounts for a huge amount of the energy consumption that we have, particularly in an industrial, commercial capacity. And also at night, we no longer really have a connection to stars in cities. We don't really see them. And there was a wonderful film called The City Dark, which really explored the relationship between humanity and its connection to the stars. And that idea that if you lose that connection, you could start to begin as a race to think that you're more important than you are. You lose that sense of perspective. And I think that light often gets talked about as it's like, oh, but it's a safety thing, so we must have it, or it's a kind of a, you know, like, oh, we're going to light this building up because we have to light the building up because we're vain and we want to, and there's no way of regulating that in the way that some cities are completely different from others because of the way in which that they've developed in the very, you know, look at London, it's got an incredibly long history, so of course it's an incredibly complicated place. But there are things like that where you just think, God, we've got it so wrong potentially, and we don't really understand the impacts of it. I mean, artificial lighting is really new. You know, you think back to the Industrial Revolution before electricity, there was no such thing as artificial light other than a candle. It's like, you know, and suddenly within a very short period of time, we've had this kind of like technological explosion, which has really propelled us to do things. And some of that's good. LEDs have reduced our energy consumption, but unfortunately that's meant that we can light everything. So, and that's, you know, that's not good. So I mean, my house is appallingly lit. It's getting better.
I'm so surprised by that. I thought you were going to tell me, no, it's perfect.
No, I mean, it's not great. I mean, I'm currently lit with a little ring light and a bulb that's on the end of a cable, but it's...
So you leave it, the hard work goes into the job. Not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point.
I think it's hugely important. I think we've really shifted. So I think we've really shifted the sort of paradigm, which was you used to go to university, guaranteed a job for life. I mean, I don't think a job for life exists anymore. And I'm not a millennial, but I sometimes think like one. And I can also think to myself, God, I can't imagine doing the same job my whole life. Like that in itself is quite terrifying. So I think that it's hugely important, but not necessarily in the capacity of you must start a company. But I feel like the days of even in a creative industry, it's been like, oh, I'm the designer, so I just go off and do what I want to do. It's like, even if you're just running a project or trying to achieve something as a creative endeavor, you're going to have restraints on resources, and you've got to kind of produce something. And at the end of the day, you'll probably have to make money from it if you want to survive. And whether that's doing it for your own company or doing it for someone else's, like those things you have to be mindful of all the time. And everyone who works in our studio knows that we're a professional service effectively. So we sell time, which means that you have to be responsible for when someone says, oh, just do all this extra work. You have to be like, okay, but that's outside of what we agreed. So that's changing scope. And it's like all of that stuff is being entrepreneurial and finding the opportunities to make money or reconsidering how we do something to do it more efficiently. And I think it's hugely important because that culture shift is only going to get more pronounced as time goes on, I think. It's a really good question. To paraphrase really appallingly, so Ken Robinson describes creativity and imagination as two separate things. So being imaginative is coming up with lots and lots of ideas, but being creative is coming up with lots of ideas, but with the ability to filter out the ones that are not useful. It's like, you know, what would you do with this paperclip? You could do all these things. And it's like, yeah, but half of those things aren't going to happen or can't work, or it's taking something which is inherently imaginative, but being able to refine it down to something that is useful, to me is what creativity is, because lots of people have great ideas. A lot of people are imaginative, but when you ask, it's like, and they're actually often the hardest people to work with because they have loads of ideas, and you kind of sit there thinking, you know, half of those are stupid because of X, Y, Z. It's not just I disagree with you, but so for me, it's about having, I think he describes it as ideas of value is what creativity is. So totally stealing from someone else a definition, but I just really liked it. I thought that was a really nice way of describing what it was, ideas of value. I think it's trained totally. I mean, some people definitely have have some innate ability, but it's trained, and I think it's something that you can get better at, for sure, through exercise and training and kind of. I think sometimes, I think some people think that creativity is like, oh, it's so easy, it's just, you just sit around and come up with ideas or whatever. And it's like, but that thing of value, that like having ideas, but being able to refine them and develop them is like a rigor of thought and a discipline, really. It's like, it's easy to come up with the idea. It's hard to make the idea work. And the discipline of following that through. And I think that kind of, a bit like you would train to run a marathon, it's like you have to train to get better at these things. I look back at my career, I cringe at some of the stuff that I've done in the past. I'm like, God, that's such a terrible idea. Like, why did you, now I see other people have similar ideas, and you get to a position where you're like, okay, well, we'll now manage that back into somewhere where it will work, but it's you get better at it with age, for sure. That's the hard question.
Yeah. But are there situational things? Are there the way you set up your work? Are there things like practically that you often find are in place, or how you feel, or like, is there an alchemy to creating a good place and a setting to be creative?
I think I think so. When I was younger, I was one of those, like, when I was younger, I was the kind of guy that wouldn't like cut something out. I'd rip something out. So it's like, then it's all kind of like, I can put all the things together, but they're all ripped and it's kind of fine. And I think that when I was younger, that really typified my thinking that things shouldn't be ordered, and that being not ordered was creative. And I think that I mistook that, really, because now that I am older, I think the more rigid the structure around the process, the more mental you can be. Because that there's a way of kind of like, you'll get from point A to point B because of the structure. So you don't need to worry about that, and it gives you a much greater freedom. So I think that structure is really helpful, and that has very different meanings in different industries or kind of pursuits. For us, we work through a process whereby we get to kind of key milestones, and we have a sequence by which things should be done. So it's like, we don't start doing that part of the process until we finish this part. And, but at that part, you've got to complete this sort of like the checklist to go through, because that will kind of give you the tools to get through the next stage. So process is very helpful. But when I was younger, I didn't even know what process was, let alone how to implement it.
You just had the imagination,
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to that discipline and training thing, which is, the more you understand about what you're trying to do, and the more structure you implement on a very personal kind of like, I accept the structure and I'm going to follow it, rather than just being imposed on you, the better my work became, I think, because of it. It's something that I really struggle with, because it's really difficult sometimes, and the difficulty normally stems from one of two places. One, what you're doing is not inspiring at all, and that's a bad place, because that's often the one thing that like, there's very little you can do to kind of if someone's given you something and it's not inspiring, it's quite hard to move on from that place. But it sort of leads into the second thing, which is fatigue. And I think fatigue often plays a huge part in it. And so depending on how much, what your resources are and how much time you can, it's talking to other people, it's knowing when to take a break. I personally believe that it's really hard to stop working on something when you have a deadline, because you kind of like, I know that I've got to get this done, but it then just becomes this really protracted kind of agonizing process. And so I really try sometimes to just be like, you know what, I'm just not going to think about it or look at it, and I'm going to come back to it next week, or I'm going to do something over the weekend to try and kind of do it. And I think this year has been a really good example. Like, we haven't been able to see anything, we haven't been able to do anything. It's like I've been looking at the same four walls for months. and that I think in the first lockdown was really tough. And having spoken to, or got on the phone and had counselling sessions with my friends who are also creative, you kind of get to the sense that you're also just a bit empty as well. It's like you need a bit of like sustenance or nourishment to kind of be creative. So sometimes just being like, do you know what, I can't think about this, but I'm not going to just sack off the day, but I'm going to go and do something that's productive. I'm going to go to the gallery and I'm going to think about something completely different, or I'm going to go to the exhibition or whatever. It's not always a passive process. It's an active thing that you need to do. And it's also part of an ongoing thing, which is you need to keep yourself well, like mentally, physically, and all of those things contribute to it.